Hey everyone, here we are with our third week, and now we're starting our third chapter. So, if you recall, in some of the areas that we covered on chapter 2, we looked at the features of the Constitution. One of those features was federalism. So, looking at this relationship between the national government and other governments, and then that ongoing debate on which of those governments should have the most authority on particular issues. So, very interesting topic, an ongoing fluid topic when we look at federalism. So, this is chapter 3 in our text. Okay, so this is something that we're experiencing every day. We're around federalism. We're around different levels of government. Some of us more than others, depending on where we may live and situations that we may find ourselves in. But we are certainly exposed to federalism. Here you have the definition, or at least part of the definition of federalism. Power divided between a central government and regional governments. And that's there on page 79. One of the things that I noticed when I looked over this chapter in preparation for this PowerPoint, the word power comes back quite a bit. So certainly be aware of that. The ability to influence, the ability to make decisions. So there we're thinking about that term power. We first talked about that term when we looked at what politics is all about, and when we were covering chapter 1, and certainly we're coming back to that when we consider which level of government for what particular situation should have the most power. So when you hear the term regional governments, what are we talking about there? So what might first come to mind would be state governments, and we can certainly conclude that some state governments are going to have different types of responsibilities or laws or bureaucracies within those states that other states may not have too much about, that may not really focus much on. For example, although we do certainly have in the state of Oklahoma some Coast Guard authorities and different kinds of authorities on boats because we have so many lakes, we wouldn't have that kind of responsibility along a shoreline, dealing with perhaps interacting with other countries too much, like you might find in Florida, or you might find in Texas, or you might find in Massachusetts. So you can see some differences there, certainly when it comes to perhaps managing land, dealing with agriculture. We may see some differences in one state over another. And then you can also see other forms of regional governments: cities, counties, school districts, water districts, tribes. And we can certainly see in Oklahoma where tribal government becomes a very important part of that interaction that we have with federalism. And that certainly is the case here in eastern Oklahoma, where I'm recording this in Miami, Oklahoma, in Ottawa County. That certainly becomes a key part of what takes place here in this county. And that was brought forward this summer. There was a landmark decision by the Supreme Court, 5-4 decision. So we have 9 members of the Supreme Court. So it was a narrowly divided decision, but still the majority decided that roughly half of the land in Oklahoma is still Indian territory. And now, what are the ramifications of all of that? We're not fully aware of it, but this headline from this summer suggests what it might mean, and more than likely will mean for the oil industry, this is the 4th largest oil producing state in the country, Oklahoma. But this is the headline from Washington Post. Now that half of Oklahoma is officially Indian land, oil industry could face new cost and environmental hurdles. So this case really dealt with a law enforcement issue in a jurisdiction in a particular case on where a Native American should be tried who had the responsibility, the jurisdiction to try that individual. But beyond that is just, again, what are the full ramifications to say that about half the state of Oklahoma is Indian land? And, just a brief review of Oklahoma history. This was two separate territories in the state of Oklahoma. This, where we are in eastern Oklahoma, was known to be Indian territory. Oklahoma territory was in western Oklahoma. And there was a movement, an attempt to have two separate states, and that Indian territory would be known as the state of Sequoia. In my office, I have a map. It's a copy, but it's a map of what Sequoia was intended to be, and it would be its own state. So there you have that type of history here, and still trying to figure out what it might mean now with this decision by the Supreme Court. But it clearly does tell us that whether we are citizens of a particular tribe or not, we are increasingly going to see the activity of tribal governments here in eastern Oklahoma. And I should just point out then, before we move on to another segment of the text, of course, that's not in our text, right? That our text was published before that particular court case this summer. So here we're looking at this ongoing relationship among governments. To try to have things run fairly smoothly is this acceptance among states and then local governments within those states to honor the public acts and judicial decisions made among that take place in other states. So this is referred to as the full faith and credit clause. And so the general assumption then, if something has taken place in another state, that it will be honored and followed in other states. So you can imagine that if you had a financial contract, and so somebody has now signed the contract that they're going to pay back, they owe money on a car, $25,000, let's say. And now they left that state and they moved somewhere else, and as soon as they moved, they no longer had to pay for that car. You can imagine then how it would just economically cause the system to collapse. So we do have to have a situation where most of the time people are going to honor the contracts from one state to the next. But might there be a situation where you have one state not honoring the contracts of another state or the decisions of another state? And so can you think of an act or decision that another state may not honor? And we'll just pause here. You can put that in your notes or write that out on chat and think of a situation there where they may not honor that. Okay, in the early part of this chapter, you can also see some descriptions there of differences among the states and cities. So, I mean, part of the whole advantage, what's supposed to be the advantage of having federalism, is that now you can have local governments, state governments respond in different ways to challenges that are going to be in a beneficial response for that local area. In other words, that the area there, the state government or the local government would know best how to handle that situation because they're closer to the situation. And whatever it might be, they just know more about it. Perhaps they live there, they have a cultural connection. This may not always be the case, but that is the idea, that a state and local government involving a state or local issue would have a better way of responding. And so that's where we would end up with differences among the states. And you can see that reflected in police power, where power reserved to the state government to regulate this is power reserved to the state government to regulate the health, safety, and morals of its citizens. And we'll think about that last part there, morals. But we've certainly seen this in some ways. How do we see differences among health, safety, and morals among the citizens. So notice the term police power in your text is not referring to the police might be involved, but it's not looking at the power of police in a particular case. It's just saying overall that this is the responsibility of a state to regulate the health, safety, and morals of its citizens. And then beyond the state government, or perhaps down the ladder from state government, depending on how you view these arrangements of governments, you have home rule, which is the power delegated to the states to a local unit of government to manage its own affairs. So you would give city governments the freedom, the liberty, we've used that word in some cases, to be able to make its own decisions in a way to manage its own affairs. And so that you would have different types of governments and different laws or policies from one local government compared to another. And so that would be the freedom to come up with new laws and policies from one city to the next. What might be an example of different regulation of morals among the states? So we'll pause here and you can see if you can come up with some differences there. Where do we see the regulation of morals that might be different from one state to the next? We'll move on here. Some of you perhaps were thinking of this. I mean, we can certainly see that we have differences. Now, when you look at the question of morals, is it a question of morals on letting marijuana be legal or having it legal from a medicinal point of view? I mean, I would imagine some of you here could certainly argue, or you would hear other people argue, that it is not moral, it's immoral to prevent someone from having access to a drug or a medicine that might alleviate their pain. And that could be one way of viewing marijuana. But then there's another way of viewing this, that it's perhaps creating greater immorality by making this available, and that there's not punishments associated with making it available. But we can certainly see that there are differences among the states on how this is regulated. So you have some states, and you may not be able to read the ledger from where you're viewing this PowerPoint, but in dark green are states that allow for marijuana even for recreational use. In light green, which would, as we can see here, include Oklahoma, you have marijuana that's used for medicinal purposes. And then you have other states that don't have a law on either one of those. Now, this is, of course, a little bit out of date, and this may have changed. There may be some differences there from in a modern, a more current map than what we have here. But certainly that's where we can see differences on the use of police power. And then we have the last here is to look at home rule and how it might be different from one city to the next. And this is dangerous dog ordinances. And so one of the things that you might see among the cities within a state is based upon what are the state regulations involving particular dog breeds. Now you see the initials here, you might be able to make that out where it says BSL, and that's breed specific laws. So the states that are in black here have no breed specific laws. So you couldn't make a law that identifies a particular breed of dog and says that this city could ban that breed of dog. But notice in red that there are BSLs, and this would be then, there's no state law that prohibits it, but they can be enforced. And so that would suggest that they're enforced at that local level. And I happen to know that they are enforced at the local level in some areas of Kansas. So there would be some breeds of dog of course, we're generally talking about the pit bull that would not be allowed in some areas. So you do have some differences there. The difference on the gray areas, use the term grandfathered, meaning that you would have some exemptions because of previous ownership of particular dog breeds. So that's where you can see the use of home rule in some states that allows for local governments to come up with their own area of enforcement on this issue here. All right, so we're here just looking at some examples of differences among the states and also among other forms of regional governments. So the next time that we're looking over federalism, we'll talk about how federalism has changed over the years and how we see more power among the national government, but in some cases where that power has been shifting back to state governments. And we'll be covering those in our next recording.